Welcome to IdeaMix Performance and Wellness, where world-leading coaches and scientists explain how their research can help you achieve your personal and professional goals faster.
So welcome to Unleash Your Power of Connection, Building Strong Relationships Through Vulnerability and Empathy. My name is Jamie Kosmar. I'm the head of client experience, and I'm going to open up actually with being vulnerable today by telling you this is the first IdeaMix webinar I've ever hosted. I do have a podcast which I interview guests, but I have not had the opportunity to do a live webinar. So that's how I'm making myself vulnerable as an example for today's webinar. For those of you who are joining us for a second, third time, welcome back. Thank you for joining us and our coach experts on our topics of the day. For those of you joining us for the first time, just a little bit about IdeaMix, and just in case you don't know us, IdeaMix Coaching works with leaders and companies to achieve professional and personal goals with the help of qualified coaches. And if you want to learn more about IdeaMix, who we are, our coach network, check us out, theideamix.com. Today, I'm very, very excited to be here with Coach Andrea, who is joining us from North Carolina. Very briefly, Coach Andrea has been coaching for 16 years, and she works with people to help them live their best lives through achieving their personal and professional goals. She has numerous certifications. I'm going to highlight maybe a couple of the ones that you've heard of. She is a professional certified coach from the International Coaching Federation, as well as a facilitator in Dr. Brene Brown's work. And much of what we're going to talk about today has been inspired by that work. In addition to being a coach, she is a podcast host, a keynote speaker, and a writer who has actually authored 3 wonderful books. So congratulations on an awesome achievement. Her clients are high-achieving women leaders who she helps navigate issues such as hard conversations, work-life balance, mindset shifts, burnout, and a values clarification. Today, Coach Andrea is going to help us understand the ABCs of building relationships and connecting with others, particularly with the lens of at the workplace. So thank you, Coach Andrea, for joining us today, and welcome.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to talk about this, and I am just elated to be here. Thank you again.
I'm very excited about this topic in particular, and there's a couple of reasons why. One, I think that I oftentimes COVID now and COVID time seems like a distant memory, but I still feel like to some extent we are living through the wake of that COVID experience. And I believe that one of the sort of backlashes of that experience was the isolation and people's withdrawal from connection. So, I think that what I hope people take away from today is this idea that even if you're feeling a little rusty, these are skills that you can develop. There's a way to get back your mojo when it comes to building relationships and connecting with others. I also think this is a very timely topic as we see what is happening across college campuses today with young students, particularly ones who have had a lot of that COVID experience well. And I think, one of the things that is always in the back of my mind, if we can just get at a table, sit down and connect with each other and have a conversation, I think that we could hopefully assuage some of our differences. So for those reasons, I'm very excited to be talking today. I would like to start with just very basic questions that we're going to spend a brief moment on. Let's set the stage. Let's set the table. What do we mean by empathy, and what do we mean by vulnerability?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I agree with everything that you said around that. And I think the pandemic just really shone a light on so many of the issues that we face today and the challenges. And I'm going to start with vulnerability. And Brene Brown describes it as risk and emotional exposure. And I think it sometimes can be helpful if I give examples. And so, Patrice, if I can use you as an example again, like getting on video here for this call is vulnerable. Me showing up here as a leader, even though I have an expertise in this topic, is vulnerable. Jamie, you hosting this webinar for the first time is vulnerable. Having hard conversations with our partners, with our coworkers, with our managers, with our friends, with our parents, even with our children is vulnerable. And empathy coincides with that. So empathy is the exchange that we have with another person when we share something vulnerable with them. So if Jamie and I are good friends and I share with her that, my marriage is in trouble, I'm having a really difficult time, and we'll definitely get more into this. The way that she responds matters as my friend. And so if she responds with empathy, that might look like, gosh, Andrea, I'm so sorry to hear that. I know nothing I can say can make everything better, but I'm really glad that you told me. How can I support you? So that's empathy. And again, I'll get more into what empathy is not, so you can kind of compare the two. And trust me, we've all been guilty of empathetic misses, as we call them. But empathy is incredibly important when someone's being vulnerable to bridge that gap in your relationship building, in your trust building. And it's incredibly important as a leader in the workplace as well.
Great. I think that was a great start of setting the stage and defining what we mean by these specific skills and what they look like. So thank you for that explanation. Let's talk further and say, now that we've set the stage, why is it important? Why are these skills important for building strong relationships? Why is your response important?
One of the reasons that I found Dr. Brene Brown's research in 2009. And one of the reasons that I was so drawn to it was because it's based in science. It's not just something that somebody made up. So I'm interested in the data, like show me the research. And that's what her research is based on, is these relationships. And we know that from the research that through vulnerability and empathy, as well as compassion, we can talk about that a little bit too. The data shows us that this is how we as humans build connection to each other. This is how we build trust in these small increments over time. If anyone, just side note, if anyone's interested in learning more about this work in romantic relationships, John Gottman's research shows the same thing, that trust is built in small increments over time. And our connections, we're social creatures. We're wired and built for these human connections. It's yes, how we get hurt in our life, whether it's in our personal life or at work. And it's also how we heal. We heal even trauma through connection in our relationships. So when we have these skills, and they're skills, like I remember the first time I saw empathy at work, like really in person between two people, I was blown away. And my first thought was, I don't know how to do that. I immediately want to fix it. And this was in coach training, you guys. It was in 2007. And I was like, what is that? Why isn't she strategizing and hyping her up? And no, it's a skill that we learn. We're not born with it. And so that's why I'm also excited to do this, because like, even if you're totally lost and don't know where to start, there are ways to get you to go there. So I get excited. I went off on a little bit of a tangent, but that's why, because bottom line is the research shows us that that's how we connect.
Yes, I 100% agree with you. I think the sort of conceptualization of these attributes, which some people just seem to do more naturally or not naturally, I would say for me, it has been a learning. I have a husband who's super empathetic and very people oriented, and he has taught me so much, because I actually grew up in a home where there was no empathy. And so because of having grown up in that space, I never had a model to see and know, like, oh, this is what it looks like. This is what it sounds like. So I've learned a lot through my husband. But thank you for sharing that. So why does it matter to start with the understanding of what the myths are, of vulnerability are?
Yeah. I like to start in webinars like this with understanding what the myths are, because it can be helpful for us to connect the dots as to why we are the way that we are. Sometimes we can feel that we're wrong, or that, we beat ourselves up a little bit. Like, I don't know, I don't mind learning about vulnerability, but I don't want to do it. I don't know how to do empathy. When we can look at what was modeled for us, and again, if we had a lot more time, we would spend more time here, but I do want people to think about, how did you grow up? Like you just said, Jamie, like it wasn't modeled for you. It wasn't modeled for me either. My parents did the best they could with what they had. I always like to preface that.
Yes. Yes.
But it was very much a mindset, and if you grew up in the US, and I think in Canada as well, and a lot of Western countries, very much individualism, pick yourself up, dust yourself off. Feelings don't change and they don't solve any problems. Go to your room and cry, and when you're done, come out. And it was, vulnerability was looked at as weakness, not brave at all. And so if you can just accept that, it's like, okay, that's how I grew up. That's what was shown to me. Of course, I don't have the skills. Of course, I think that vulnerability is this thing that we avoid. And so my hope is that when you can look at that, you can have some compassion for the people that raised you. They were flawed humans that were raised by flawed humans, et cetera, et cetera. Now we're here to break the cycle and learn new life skills, learn new human skills, and so that we can move forward in a more positive trajectory.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the first step is sort of recognizing and acknowledging that background, but then thinking, how do I bring it forward so that I'm not carrying that lens or suitcase or whatever you want to call it, that model with me forward. And whether it's just in your life generally, or maybe if you have children, like not passing along to your kids as well. And let's talk about, what are the attributes of empathy?
The attributes, well, do you want me to get into what are the 6 myths of vulnerability first before we get into empathy? Okay,
yes.
Yeah. Let's start there. So the first is that vulnerability is weakness. A lot of us, even if it's unconscious, when we think about being vulnerable ourselves, we look at it as weakness. When we see it in other people, many times we see it as courage. And what the research shows us is that there's no data at all that shows us that vulnerability is weakness, that it actually is courage. It takes the attribute of bravery in order to be vulnerable. And again, I'm going to kind of whip through these because both the myths of vulnerability and the attributes of empathy, I do want you to know them. Luckily, this is being recorded, so if you want to go back and take better notes, but I do want to spend time, Jamie and I will spend more time a little bit later talking about the how, like how do we do this? And so the second myth is that you can opt out of vulnerability. Again, so if Jamie and I are good friends, my understanding might be, I want Jamie to be vulnerable with me because I see it as courageous in her, but I want to opt out. Like it's not for me. It's not my favorite, as they like to say in the South. It's not my favorite. That's another myth, that you can opt out, and you can't. It has to be a mutual thing that you're doing. And I'm looking down at my notes here to make sure that I don't forget any. The third one is that vulnerability is oversharing. And I think with the onset of social media, we have seen this a lot, and that, people will say like vulnerability post and they're blasting it out to, thousands of their Twitter followers or on Facebook or whatever it is. And sometimes it is. I think that, the research shows us that the vulnerability that we're talking about here is vulnerability one-on-one with your partner. It's vulnerability with your team. It's vulnerability with your manager, not necessarily talking about the details of your divorce to all these people on social media. Or I think we've all sat next to someone on the plane when we're traveling, and either we or the other person is just sort of like dumping everything. And we do, I want to say too, like we do those with genuine reasons to connect. Sometimes we're attention seeking, and that's okay. Sometimes we just like have a story inside of us where we feel like we're going to die if we don't tell someone, but it's not the right person to tell. So the vulnerability that we're talking about here today is not oversharing, and it does take practice. So the fourth is that we can go at it alone, is that we don't need vulnerability. We don't need to share it with anyone else, that we can just be vulnerable by ourselves. And that's not how it works. Vulnerability happens with other people. That's how we connect. It is important, of course, be vulnerable with your journal. And also vulnerability happens with other people. And myth number 5, I'm gonna read this from the research to make sure that I get it right. The myth is that you can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. That you can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. It's kind of like picking the ingredients that you want. And what research shows us is when it comes to interactions between humans, they always involve uncertainty, they involve risk, and they involve emotional exposure. We cannot engineer that out. They go hand in hand like peas and carrots. And then myth number 6 is that trust must come in the relationship before vulnerability. And that's not necessarily true. A lot of John Gottman's work shows that trust is built in small increments over time, and we build trust through vulnerability. So we have to take that first small step. And again, the emphasis on small increments over time. And so that's it. Those are the 6 myths of vulnerability.
Yeah. I just want to pause there. Thank you for sort of giving these examples of the oversharing, because I did have a question around like, how do you know if something's oversharing or whatever? I've definitely been at that, sort of like work party where that person has just grabbed you and been like, I have to tell you this and I won't stop.
Yeah. I'm happy to talk more about that if we have time, because it's a really great question.
Yeah, absolutely. And then also, I think, this idea that being vulnerable is going to feel uncomfortable, right? It just is.
Yes.
But the more you practice that discomfort, the more you're okay with it, right? Right. The more you sort of can be brave.
You're correct. It's like mastering anything. I've been up on stage many times in front of hundreds and thousands of people, and do I still get nervous? Of course I do. Is it a little bit easier? Yes. And I think it varies from person to person, and that's really how I feel about vulnerability. I think that if you have like a one-on-one relationship, that's where it really starts to lessen. But when you're vulnerable with a brand new person, you're gonna feel that uncomfortableness that you just talked about all over again.
Yeah. So why don't we move to the attributes of empathy now, to understand sort of this other skill that is important for connection?
Yeah. I think I want to spend just a minute or two talking about what empathy isn't. I know I gave you a very brief example when we first kicked it off on what empathy can look like. And what empathy isn't, and I want to preface this by saying, I think we all could raise our hand and say that we have either been on the receiving end of one of these responses or been the one giving these responses. So if someone shares something vulnerable with me and I immediately try to fix it and solve the problem, that's not empathy. If someone shares something vulnerable with me and I try to one up them, and this one can be tricky because the question I always get after this one is, all right, sometimes I want to share something where I'm relating. I experienced this when my father passed away a few years ago, and people would say, I lost my dad in 2012. I totally understand what that feels like. That's not one-upping. That's relating. But one-upping would be if someone told me about, how an egregious story about losing their father that was so much worse than mine when I just shared that my father just passed away. That's one-upping. It's like, oh, Jamie, you think you have problems at work. Wait till I tell you about my team and how bad they've dropped the ball. That's one-upping. Another response could be that if someone is dismissive, if they say like, oh, you must be exaggerating. It couldn't be that bad. I've met the people on your team. They're great. They're probably showing up and you're just not seeing it. That's another one. There's other examples of empathetic misses. Just kind of an overview of what that's like. And when we get those responses, it can feel like crap. We feel not understood. We feel not seen in our story of what we're really struggling with. And so empathy is, there's a nursing scholar named Teresa Wiseman, who this is her research, and she came up with 4 attributes, and the Brene Brown senior faculty added a 5th one based on additional research around self-compassion. So I just want to give credit where credit is due. The first attribute of empathy is perspective taking. So that's where I am trying to see your perspective of what you might be experiencing, not necessarily mine. Because, say Jamie's working with a team and they're all over the world, and there's some language barriers and some culture things that she's trying to get used to. I've never managed an international team, so I don't know what that's like. So if she's telling me something challenging, I am trying to see what it's like from her perspective, even though I have not experienced that before, which is tricky, and it's vulnerable for both of us. The next attribute is staying out of judgment, which we all like to do that. Pastime. Favorite pastime is it's a universal thing that we do as humans. And what that might look like if we're in judgment is thinking something like, well, I wouldn't have done it that way. Like, why isn't she? So staying out of judgment as best we can. The third attribute of empathy is recognizing the emotion in the other person, even if they have not said anything yet about how they're feeling. So if one of you is sharing with me something that difficult that happened to you, that you had to let go of someone on your team, and you have to be the one to have the conversation. I might just get curious of what the emotion is around that. And I could say, it sounds like you're really sad about it. And I might be wrong when I say it. And then that gives them the opportunity to say, I'm actually really frustrated. At this point, I'm really frustrated that this person didn't, da, 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 da. So recognizing the emotion. And then the 4th step directly related to that is communicating it. It's just what I said. And for example, if they told me how they're feeling, it might be echoing that back to them and saying, gosh, that does sound frustrating that you gave them all these opportunities. And so I'm sure you're kind of starting to see maybe in your own life how when all of those things are present, when the person has shown that they can try to understand your perspective, when they have not judged you, when they have recognized the emotion in you, you feel seen and understood. And there's a sense of relief that comes over you. There's a sense of connection, and this builds trust. When someone nails empathy, or when you nail it with someone else, this is trust building. And the 5th and last one, the attribute of empathy that comes from Kristen Neff's work around compassion, is mindfulness. And that simply is paying attention. It's a couple of things. It's paying attention to what is happening. In order to really do empathy well, we have to really be listening and be paying attention to the other person and what's going on over there. It might be their body language. It might be their facial expressions. Of course, it's the words that they're saying. And also, what I want to really emphasize around mindfulness, and that Brene talks if I facilitate this in a workshop format, what we really want to emphasize is that we're going to get empathy wrong. And it's never too late to circle back with someone if you do. So if I'm on one of y'all's team, I'm just going to pick somebody's name here, Melissa. If we're on a team together and you share something really difficult with me, and I maybe jump to solution, I'm like, well, did you try this? Did you talk to HR? Did you do? Da, 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 da. And later on that day, I'm at my desk thinking, oh crap, empathy probably would have been a better choice there, and I missed it. So I could circle back with Melissa later that day and say, hey, you shared something hard with me, and I realized I jumped to solution, and I'm sorry, and that doesn't sound like what you needed. You didn't ask me for advice. So can we try that again? That is circling back. And that's vulnerable. That's vulnerable for me to come back and say, hey, I made a mistake. I messed up. I want to try again. So that is also trust building. And sometimes
Mm-hmm.
it takes pushing our ego to the side to circle back with someone and realize your mistake and try again. So that's
Is
empathy.
there
Short
is
version
there
of
ever yeah, is there ever a time when you don't recommend circling back? Like, is there?
I don't think so. I give this example in one of my books. One of my childhood best friends. Oh, we were adults at this point. We were probably in our 30s, and her grandmother passed away, and I had grown up around her grandmother. I called her Grammy just like everybody else, and her grandmother passed away. And she had and my friend and I had kind of lost touch. We went to different colleges, and but it was like that friend where no matter what, we would connect, and it was like no time had passed at all. And she let me know that her grandmother passed away, and that told me when the funeral was, and I didn't go to the funeral. And so it was years later. And I circled back with her, my friend Karina, and I told her, and I said, I wanted to circle back with you and apologize for not showing up to Grammy's funeral. I was going through a really difficult time. I don't mean to give excuses, and it's on me. I should have been there for you. I should have been
Mm-hmm.
there to pay my respects to Grammy. She was so great, and I didn't. And I'm really sorry. That's
Yeah.
trust. That's trust building, and that was vulnerable and hard. And so yeah, I don't think so. Were you thinking of a specific example?
No, no. I
Okay.
just, I was wondering like if so much time passes or whatever. I mean, I don't, again, I'm not the expert on these skills. So,
Yeah,
I was just looking for direction on that, whether it's
it's a good
ever
question.
too late.
What I would do, I want to
Um,
just add one quick thing on there, is what I would do is I would acknowledge the time that has passed
yeah,
and say, I should have circled back with you years ago about this, and I didn't. And I wanted to say I'm sorry for that as
yeah,
well. That's on
yeah.
me.
And now that I'm coming back, it feels a little even more awkward after all
Exactly.
this
Just
time,
name it. Just name
right?
it.
Yeah, yeah,
Say what's there.
yeah. I also just want to acknowledge, that additional fifth mindfulness attribute I think is really key. And, I think about all the things about the perspective taking, not being judgmental. I feel like this mindfulness is the pillar of being able to do all those things,
Hmm.
right? You have to be truly listening. You have to have, I have a grade school daughter, and they're, whole body listening, right? Whole body listening to be able to then respond with empathy, I think.
Hmm. Yeah, I agree with that.
Um, so now that we understand the attributes and the myths and what these skills are, how do we give and receive them?
Yeah. Well, I'd love to focus a little bit on work because I think that's why a lot of us are here. And I can throw in some personal examples as well because they coincide. They definitely cross paths. But, trust, as I've mentioned several times, trust and connection matter in the workplace just as they do in your personal lives, especially for leaders. It might just look a little bit different. And, there are some things that we might not share at work that, maybe it's just not safe for us to share, depending on several factors, or just not appropriate. It just doesn't matter. But again, trust and connection matter just as much in the workplace as they do at home. And to go a little bit, dig a little bit deeper about that is listening skills are imperative. Making sure someone is heard and not thinking about a solution or not thinking about what is the response that we're going to give. I have two teenagers right now, and the advice I keep hearing over and over again from the experts, because I am not one when it comes to parenting, my oldest is 16, and is that a lot of teenagers, the feedback that they give therapists or people that aren't their parents is, I just wish my parents would listen to me. I just want them to listen to me. And
Mm,
I think that really never goes away. I think it might be at its peak when we're teenagers. So we're still seen as children, but we all just want to be seen and heard. And this matters in the workplace as a leader. It also matters because of giving and receiving feedback, which time and time again, as I coach a lot of female leaders, and it is sometimes, there's training at work around how to give feedback, and sometimes there's not. And so that's a lot of times what they come to me for. And whether you know it or not, when you are doing that, when you are giving or receiving feedback, trust and connection is either being built or broken down. That matters. It matters so much. And it can be repaired. It absolutely can be repaired, by the way. It's not, broken forever, depending on the situation, I suppose. And, the last thing I want to mention as, like why it's so important is to be compassionate towards someone's lived experience. As you mentioned, the pandemic did a number on most of us, I think. And it also, again, really just highlighted a lot of discrepancies that we have in terms of how we're not connecting, how we're not seeing or understanding people's lived experience, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that the more compassionate we can be with people with boundaries as well, those matters too, which is another conversation for another time. I'm happy to come on and talk about that, but that matters. And that also builds trust and connection and even community within your workplace or within your home life. So I'm happy to get into, like the nitty gritty with any of those if you want, Jamie, or if anybody has specific questions. I don't want to ask for questions. I want you can be in charge, but I just was saying that I kind of wanted to leave it open to see what the need was.
Yeah, I actually have a follow-up question to what you were just talking about, because we have seen workplaces migrate to sort of hybrid. Right. So, the office is no longer the place where everybody goes to work together. And there's just much more remote, hybrid. People aren't necessarily going to always be in the same place at the same time on a consistent basis, as they used to be. So what does that mean for sort of how we give and receive these skills, right? Is it appropriate? What's appropriate to do on a Zoom, and what should you be waiting for to do in person, right? Those are the types of things like, we don't read, there's no playbook, right? Because we sort of were thrown in the pandemic. We were thrown into this, technology oriented situation. So if you're a leader, and, you've got a team of juniors, what sort of, what do you need to be thinking about?
Yeah, I think it's nuanced and specific for every job title, for every company, for every topic. And I think sometimes we're just forced to have hard conversations like this, and it's tricky. And I think the more we can do things probably that we're already doing, like making sure that you are distraction free, if you need to, blur out your background, if you, prep as much as possible. And also, I'm going to mention it again, I'm a huge fan of saying what's there. And so if it's a hard conversation that we have to have over video, then I would preface it by saying, this is definitely a conversation that I would prefer to have in person with you, as it's a vulnerable one and a hard one. But alas, here we are, and we have to do it this way. So I just wanted to acknowledge that from the beginning. This is not my first choice. And then have the conversation. What I would do is I would, if it were me, and I would have a running list of notes of specific, and maybe it's not just conversations, but it's things that I want to touch on with someone when, even if it's once a year that you get together with your team in person, because there is really something to be said about seeing someone and being within their presence and energetically being together. I mean, I'm not getting all woo-woo here. Just like, we know this, like we're all old enough to remember what it was like when we were in the office and had in-person conversations. I would have a list of things, if we're getting together for a retreat, and, I would pull Jamie aside and say, hey, even if it's something as simple as, I just want to let you know, now that we're here in person, like I'm just so excited to finally get to meet you after so many video calls. And I just, and compliment them or something. Like those are the things that build trust and connection over time. There was one more thing I was going to say, and gosh darn it, perimenopause, it left me. It'll come back to me, and then I'll bring it back in.
Okay.
Did
Yeah,
I
you were
answer
just talking
that?
about, yeah, you did. Yeah, you were just
Okay.
talking about the list and making sure that there are certain topics that it's just better basically, and to make a prioritize them. Prioritize also making sure that you do have that in-person touch point is quite important.
As much as
Um,
possible.
I've been reading a lot as well about how, we have this generation that doesn't know a time when there weren't computers. And social media is a part of life. And so how, as a leader, do it's not always the case, but sometimes because of the frequent interaction on social media, some of this connecting skills are missing in these younger generations. So if you are a leader of somebody who seems to not be getting it, how do you help somebody who's working for you
Hmm.
start to get it and be able to practice these skills?
Yeah. I think, and I think that the research is going to be interesting to see a couple of things. What are the implications and the impact of the pandemic in terms of like the hybrid workplace, like you were saying, or some people are completely remote? I think it's been wonderful in some aspects, that people can get jobs all over and can stay home and all of those things. But also, again, I think it's gonna be interesting. We see the research coming out in a few years of what are the negative consequences of that, as well as
Mm-hmm.
Generation Z, and then I know Gen Alpha is only, teenagers right now, but eventually when they come in, this is all they're going to know. So what we're going to see from that. My answer is skills like this is learning these types of skills and having professional development brought in that teach people these skills. And not only that, but having them be able to practice it. It's definitely one thing to hear about it and learn about it. You can read about it in books, and that's all great. But these types of skills have to be practiced. So if you are, if you're a decision maker at a company, and you're hiring professional development, like my encouragement is to hire experts who have the workshop be interactive, so that these people
Mm-hmm.
have to practice these skills, because these skills are vulnerable. You're not just reading from a script. Like, you can certainly start out that way. And that's what I give people when I do these workshops, is like, what do I say when someone's parent died, and, and they have to come back to work in 3 days? Uh, it can feel awkward, and you don't want to say the wrong thing, and you probably are going to say the wrong thing, and you stumble. It takes practice, like mastering anything else. I think that the very first time that I ever saw it in action, the woman had been practicing it for a long time. And I remember when my dad died, the hospice nurses were so good at it. And I'm like, oh my gosh, are you from this planet? Yes,
Mm-hmm.
they just were able to practice it. So anyway, the bottom line is, have professional development that comes in that teaches these specific skills, and have people practice it, and just, again, be very transparent about how vulnerable and uncomfortable it is, and it just encourage people to hang on tight. Like, we're
Yeah.
all here, we all feel the same way, because when you are vulnerable and uncomfortable, it can feel very lonely and isolating. Like, I'm the only one that feels this way. No one else at this training is as uncomfortable as I am. And yes, depending on your neurodivergence, you might have a little bit more discomfort, but we're all in this boat together in terms of how vastly uncomfortable it is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's a very good suggestion. And I suspect that is something that you can help with, at the company level. And as well at IDMX, we have coaches who are, trained and certified as well, and helping to teach these skills, particularly intergenerationally as well.
Mm.
I'm going to move to some questions that we have in the chat.
So maybe the first one refers back to an earlier part of the conversation. Do these myths apply equally in professional and personal settings?
I believe yes. I think that typically these myths. Let me read through them again. And was there, if the person that asked that question, was there one in particular that you wanted to look at? vulnerability is weak. These are the myths. Vulnerability is weakness, that you could opt out of vulnerability. Vulnerability is oversharing, that you can go at it alone, do vulnerability by yourself, that you can engineer the uncertainty and discomfort out of vulnerability. I would say that one is a pretty big one at work because work can be a little trickier in terms of boundaries, that we want to, kind of parse out, like, okay, I want to be vulnerable because everybody tells me that it's important in the workplace, but I don't want like this particular part of it. And I don't want it to be that risky. I don't want there to be any emotion involved. It's like, it's the same. It's the same whether you are talking to your partner or you are talking to your coworker. Vulnerability is vulnerability. Empathy is empathy. So I guess I just answered the question. It's the same.
So I actually asked the question because, and I know this has changed over time, thankfully, but I think particularly as women, right, at least when I first came to workforce, there was very much like an unspoken rule to try to separate out your personal and professional life. It was a stereotype. And 100% get the kind of, especially on a one-on-one basis, the ability to build trust by being vulnerable. And maybe you draw the line on the oversharing, which you mentioned, and that's how you calibrate. But I do think there's a little bit still a challenge of balancing vulnerability versus oversharing versus versus trust, and still kind of maintaining a proper professional leadership role, however you want to kind of frame that. And so I think some of the examples, maybe when you kicked off, were more, speaking about friends and family. So it was more personal. So it kind of struck me as it wasn't entirely clear, how to apply that, or whether it was always going to be the case in a professional setting.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's, if we had more time, I could go into the nitty gritty, and I'm so glad you brought this up. Thank you, Sharon. Would it be helpful if I gave an example of like what it might look like at work to sort of like create a boundary as to how much you're sharing?
Well, I feel like it's almost, it's partly boundaries, but it's also like what kind of vulnerability. Like some types of sharing does promote trust, but I feel like sometimes it is, uh, so it's not a hard line of no vulnerability, but I have found um like not necessarily wanting to share everything or that much.
Yeah. Can I just jump in here for a second? Because I think sometimes culture doesn't permit you to be vulnerable, right? The culture of the organization that you're in, particularly if you're in a leadership position, right? And so I think there is this environmental factor that basically probably filters into where your boundaries have to be.
Mm-hmm. So it's a matter of feeling exactly what you said, Jamie. It's a matter of feeling out the culture. It also is a matter of feeling at what level that you're at. And my advice is to take all of those things into consideration, as well as drip it out very selectively and in very small increments. So for example, if you have a team member that comes to you and is sharing some details about their life, and maybe they're one of their children is having a lot of problems and it's affecting their work, et cetera. So an example of that might be that you share anecdotally that something like that similarly has happened in your life. So I use this example sometimes when I'm talking about it. When I was many years ago, and I was in therapy, and I told my therapist, who I'd been seeing for a long time, and she was probably a woman who's my age now. And I basically said, like, I make up a story that your life is perfect. Like you're so wise and you have such great advice. Like, do you ever have problems in your marriage? And what I was really wanting from her, and I know that this isn't what they want and from a therapeutic standpoint, but she was someone who, like, there was a bit of a power dynamic. And what I was so desperate is for her to show me her human side. Is like, please relate to me, because I am feeling less than, because I'm making up a story that you never have these problems that I'm bringing to you. So in effect, she was a leader. She was a leader for me. And she sort of laughed and she said, I do. And all she shared was like an anecdote about an argument that she got in with her husband. And it was kind of funny. And like, that's all I needed. Like the sense of relief that I felt in that moment and that trust and connection being built. I was like, okay, we're all human. We all have mistakes. And so I hope that helps, Sharon. And just like, I think the bottom line of it is that, again, feel out the company culture, what position you're at, what person you're actually interacting with. Like, do I recommend you sharing something like that in a meeting full of, stakeholders? And no. But if it's, like a one-on-one person, or even in small group, like these small increments that you're kind of dripping out, that can foster connection and trust over time. And I do want to just quickly acknowledge that, yes, sometimes it's not safe for you to be vulnerable. And there is a stereotype still that exists in terms of the gender specificity around vulnerability that's unfair, which is another conversation for another time. But I just, again, wanted to acknowledge that it does still exist.
Another question. Going back to the part of the discussion on how you can sort of apologize for not having expressed the right empathetic response. How do you respond when someone isn't receptive to your apology is the question.
So if someone isn't, so you mean like if they push back on it or they won't accept it?
I guess, and feel free to jump in. I think it was, I'm just going back to see who asked that question.
Tara
Yes,
Bernardino.
Yeah.
Yeah, that is the question. Like, what if they sort of not reiterate how much like it's hurt you that they you weren't there, let's say, for a, let's say the funeral example that you gave, if they're kind of like, well, that really, hurt me. Like, I'm sorry you were going through a hard time, but you were very close to my grandmother. Like, I don't understand how you couldn't show up. Do you kind of just acknowledge what they're feeling and sort of say, I understand. Again, I apologize, and kind of leave it at that?
Yeah, I mean, they're going to have whatever experience they're going to have, and they're entitled to whatever response that they're going to have. And yeah, sometimes it doesn't work out. Sometimes it's not accepted. So what I would do is, and there's some really great information out there on how to apologize. So I would start there and make sure that you're kind of like, I hate to say it, but like checking off all the boxes and, not making excuses. I'm probably saying like how you're going to make it better, and maybe even asking them like, is there anything I can do to make this right between our friendship? And they may have an idea or they might not. It depends on the situation. But yes, I think you're right on in terms of just making sure that I have a dear colleague that says, as long as you have conducted yourself with grace and kindness, that's really at the end of the day all you can do. And I love that phrase, and just and really making sure that you are, again, hitting all those points on what a really great and solid and kind and clear and remorseful apology looks like, as well as allowing that person to have whatever experience and response that they're going to have. And that's hard. I just want to say that's hard. Yeah. Thanks for asking that, Tara.
Thank you.
Well, another question, if you could comment on the dynamics between men and women in the workplace. Often, when people show vulnerability as a woman, it's perceived as weakness and can make for some very awkward conversations that don't lead to greater trust.
Yeah. Well, I think that, let's not throw men completely under the bus. I think that historically men are shunned in many ways for showing any emotion that isn't anger. So I think that, there's still work to be done culturally and socially around that. But you're right. In the workplace, women historically have to be careful, and I say that through gritted teeth, around how much emotion we show as well as how we present it. And there's an unfair dynamic for sure. And so I think that it's And I'm also a big fan of, I mean, keep in mind, I'm someone who tends to kind of, I'm the black sheep. P.S. I'm a black sheep in the family who was always the one. It's like, can we talk about the elephant that's in the room? I do that in workplaces too, and it hasn't always gone really well. But sometimes it does. So I think sometimes I'm going to emphasize sometimes it can be helpful to just name that. Really depends on the culture at the company that you're at, but just to name that and say, as a woman, I understand that I might be perceived as overly emotional when I say this. However, and like say whatever it is that you want to say in terms of the vulnerable thing. I hope I'm answering this question correctly. It's just I think that the more that we talk about unfair stereotypes, the more that we talk about uh, marginalized communities and how unfair it is that people are perceived a certain way, the more that we can have, like you were saying at the top of the hour, Jamie, around how sitting around it and sitting in a circle and having conversations and hearing people's lived experiences, the more we can do that, the less the stereotypes become. My hope is the less shame there is, the more compassion and listening and connection and trust that we can build.
Yes. Yes, I would agree with that. It looks like Christy Kaufman has a hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I know we're coming at time. Um, I guess two questions. How do you look at the difference between empathy and sympathy and how that plays into this? And then also, I was exiting from a kind of a toxic work culture, and as I look and interview to new positions, what are some ways that you can potentially get to the empathy of the culture and the empathy of the organization itself, particularly the board members who's what I'd be reporting to. Thanks.
Okay, two separate questions. Let me answer the first one first, and then I'll try to answer the second one as best as possible. So the difference between this one's tricky because I'm so glad that you asked this, Christy, because sympathy isn't always bad. I think if you really get into Brene Brown's work, you might get the feeling that she's saying that sympathy is the devil. Not necessarily. I think that if empathy, you can get empathy fatigue. Like I don't recommend you going around and everybody that shares, even anecdotally, something that's been difficult for you to like come in with empathy. I think it can be reserved for people that that are your closest team members or that are your close friends and family. So what I want to emphasize in terms of when kind of sympathy goes bad is when we are responding. So for instance, Christy, if you told me that you are, if you're job searching, and if I respond with, oh gosh, I'm so glad that I'm not you. That sounds like it's rough. That's like it's like I kind of am acting like I feel bad and like, trying to it's a no. But sometimes if we are just acquaintances, like we've barely met and you share, just sort of casually that something difficult happened, that your dog passed away, it's okay for you to express condolences. And like I'm so sorry. Pet loss can be the biggest awful, most hard thing ever. So I don't have to go into this big empathetic response. So sympathy can be okay. So the difference is when sympathy is given and it creates an element of, I want you to stay over there. That's what the difference is. And I wish I had more time to give more examples around it, but hopefully that helps and gives you kind of a gist of it. And your second question, Christy, is a tricky one. And I think that where I would start is you could even throw the research out there and maybe during the interview process is have a conversation and say, I always tell people you can throw me under the bus and say casually, like, I was on this webinar and they were talking about vulnerability and empathy at work. And can you give me just sort of a snapshot of what that looks like at the company culture level as well as da, 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 da. And you might take them off guard a little bit, and maybe it's something that they need to get back to you. And if they do kind of not give you the answer that you're looking for, maybe because they're just not sure, then I would say, like, do you know if there's a way for me to find out about that? That's a value of mine that is incredibly important to where I decide to accept a position. And I'm wondering if you know the right person that I could ask for that. Good question to ask during an interview. Like, bravo.
Yeah.
Bravo.
Yeah. Great. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us here today on Unleashing Your Power of Connection. And thank you, Coach Andrea, for your expertise and insight. And if anybody on the webinar would like to work with Coach Andrea, her IdeaMix profile is in the chat. And also you can go to theideamix.com and check out our network of additional coaches as well. But thank you again for joining us here today.
Thank you for all the great questions, everyone, and your time and attention. I'm incredibly grateful.
Thanks for listening. Please subscribe wherever you listen and leave us a review. Find your ideal coach at www.theideamix.com. Special thanks to our producer, Martin Maluski, and singer-songwriter Doug Allen.